Begin the current Daf, Mesech this Yoma Daf Mem begin the four lines down at the top of the Yomid, where the Gemara continues the related discussion from what we mentioned in the previous Daf, that Hagrala is Ma'akiv, that doing the lottery on the shiur of Yom Kippur Ma'akiv, and that got into a discussion regarding the rest of karbanos that are not kaveh with a girl, that rather how you designate the name, and we get into that discussion regarding other karbanos, how you designate them as their status of which carbon they're going to be. Should correspond because in the Cheskel to anything that I'm joining us today's daf. Should be discussed with Tinik Ben Yehudis. Some things we're going to discuss in today's daf are, as we mentioned, the carbon of two birds, how each carbon is designated, which one's going to be chatas, which one's going to be an oila. We get into a discussion regarding the red ribbon in the next Mishnah that the Kohen ties onto the Sar HaMishtalech. Some of the key terms of the concepts are kinin, which literally means to say the plural of nest, which is that is when the person brings a pair of kapanas, which there's four types of people that bring. There's a yoledes, there's a mitzari that's an ani. There's four types of people that bring a pair of birds, one lechatas and one as an oila. The Tamei Mikdash is someone who violates the halacha as he's tamei and he comes into the Beis Hamikdash or he partakes of kachim. He's chayiv in a carbon oila yared, which is that depending on the person's financial status, either if he's wealthy, he brings a carbon chatas behema, an animal. If he's not so wealthy, he's called dal. He's poor, so he brings two bird karbanos, one's chatas, one's an oila. And if he's dali dal, if he's very poor, then he brings a flour offering. So begin the current daf, that Mimala, four lines over the top of the Yamin. As we were talking about in the previous daf regarding that of the Hagrala, picking out one Lashem and one Lazazel. So now the Gemara gets into the discussion that's going to relate back to this halacha from our previous daf by saying Amar Rav Chizda. Chizda says, in Akinin Misparshas, the pair of birds, they do not get defined which is going to be which an oila and which is going to be as a chatas. Ella, there's only two ways that it gets defined in its establishment as which one is going to be. Ella oibel kichas bailam. Either when the owner buys it, he purchases and he says, okay, this one I'm buying for an oila, this one I'm going to be for a chatas, and then the kohen cannot change its designation anymore when he's actually sacrificing them. And if he would, then they would be invalid because one's a chatas, one's an oila. All Yabasi is kohen. Or the other option is when the kohen is going to do it, meaning if let's say when the owner purchased it, he didn't specify. So even if let's say he's going to bring his carbon in a week, and a few days into having purchased it, he says, I want this one to be a chatas, this one's an oila. It does not take effect, that designation, and the kohen can go ahead and change it because it's either by one of two times, either when he buys it or when the kohen's actually bringing it. That's when it gets designated which one's a chatzah, which one's an oila. And Amar Shimon Bar Ashi says, "My Tamid Rav Chizda, what's the reason of Chizda? What's his source?" Because the pasuk says in Meyikra, it says v'lakcha by the yoledes, who's one of the types of people when a woman gives birth. She brings, it says v'lakcha, she's going to take two turtle doves or two young pigeons, one for an oila, one's for a chatas. So it says when she's bringing it, says v'lakcha. Now by a zav, who's also someone that brings brings kinim, a pair of birds, it says v'asa, that v'asa kohen, the kohen is going to do one as a chatas, one as an oila. So obviously you see that oibelikicha, either it's going to be designated one's as a chatas, one's an oila at the time of when you purchase it, like it says by the yoledes, where it says v'lakcha, or it's going to be designated at the time of when you're actually sacrificing it, as when the kohen brings it, but sometime in between, then not. It has to be, as the pasuk says, either v'lakcha or v'asa, either when you buy it or when the kohen's bring it. Those are the two times that it's going to be able to be designated as a chatas and oila, as the pasuk there says, echad la'oila ve'echad la'chatas. However, the Gemara asks, and this is where it brings into the discussion in the previous daf, meisvei. We quoted at the end of the previous daf, it says in the pasuk regarding Yom Kippurim that you have these two higos, and one of them is going to be vaso chatas. You're going to do the lottery, and you're going to make it into chatas, which teaches us the lottery makes it into the chatas. But just calling one Lashem or calling one Lazazel, that's not going to designate it as the chatas. Now, says the Brisa, because you would have thought that actually, logic would tell us, because if regarding all other karbanos, which the lottery does not make it into a carbon, Kiddush Hashem, but when you call it a chatas, when you call it the when you call it whatever it is, that's when it becomes sanctified. So Malcolm Kiddush Hagos in Yom Kippurim, where it's even stronger. Even a Gairli is going to make it designated to be a chatas. And then Shekadish Hashem isn't a Kavachayim where it has more power that it should be able to be sanctified by calling it the name. Tamalem, that's supposed to has to teach, no, vaso chatas, that this is what's going to make it into chatas. The hagayr is a chatas, only the lottery makes it into chatas, v'neshama is a chatas, but just calling it is not going to make it into chatas. That was the brisa we quoted in the previous daf. Now, from the fact that it says over here in the brisa that in a place which on Yom Kippur, which the girl sanctifies it, isn't it a kal v'chomer that kedushas Hashem by just calling it a chatas should for sure make it into a chatas? The Gemara assumes right now what it sounds like is that the kiddush Hashem, the calling it the chatas, would work at the same time that the goyrel works. You could say, if the goyrel works, for sure, if I didn't do a goyrel on Yom Kippurim, if I just said this is Lashem, this will be the chatas. The problem is, when the Kohen Gadol says, when he does the lottery, is not at the time when he's buying it, that's not at the time when he's actually bringing it. So says the Gemara, but it'll be here at the time of the Hagrala, which you're telling me, oh, Kal V'chomer, that for sure it should work without Hagrala, it should work with just calling it a chatas. The Lav Shas Lekicha, not the time that you're buying it, but Lav Shas Asiyah, it's not the time of doing it, but you don't need the cover. And you tell me, if not for the Gzeres HaKasav, so chatas, that then you would have told me that Kriyas Hashem would work. But didn't you just tell me that Kriyas Hashem only worked either B'Shas Lekicha or B'Shas Asiyah? How could it have worked at the time of the Hagrala, which you tell me, let's say I wouldn't do Hagrala, I would do Kriyas Hashem, it would work. How does Kriyas Hashem work? It's not at either one of those times. Somewhere else he says, Hafikama. This is what the Kal V'chomer was being said in the brisa. Ma b'makim, if by other karbanas, shlei kiddush hagarel, which the kiddush hagarel doesn't work. Va'afilu b'shas lekicha, and what are we saying? A girl doesn't work. A girl doesn't work even if you did a girl at the time that you bought it. Va'afilu b'shas, even if you did it at the time of when you would bring it. But kiddush Hashem, but when you sanctify by name, b'shas lekicha b'shas asiyah, it will work if you do it at the time that you buy it and the time that when you bring it. So Malkim Shakiddush Hagara. So regarding Yom Kippur, regarding the two shiur, where it's something that gets sanctified with a lottery, so even that works Shalei B'Shas Lekicha, V'Shalei B'Shas Asiyah. That works even, as we know, the lottery is done sometime in between, not when you're purchasing the two higos, not when you're sacrificing them. So in addition, what was the Kal V'chomer? Sheikadish Hashem B'Shas Lekicha B'Shas Asiyah. We're adding on those words. The Kal V'chomer, of course, wasn't going to say the Kiddush Hashem should work at the time when the Hagrel is normally done. But that it should for sure work at the time when you purchase it, the time that you bring it. That then Kiddush Hashem should for sure work because it's Balak or Ba'asa. That's what we're saying, Tamalem, no Ba'asa Chatas, that you're going to make it into Chatas, Hagar is a Chatas, not only the lottery can make it into Chatas, Ben Hashem is a Chatas, but just calling it a Chatas is not going to make it into Chatas. But of course, everyone agrees, like Rav Chizda, that it would have to be at the time of either Lakicha or the Asiyah. We weren't saying that the Kal V'chomer should be that it should work at the time of the Hagrala. We're just saying that it should have an effectiveness of Kiddush Hashem, again, either by Lekich or Asiyah, and that we're saying, no, even at the time of Lekich or Asiyah, it's not going to work, because the Torah is telling you explicitly only the Hagrala is Eisachatas, but nothing else is going to make it in the Chatas. So the Gemara says, Tashma, the Gemara tries to bring another raya, not like Rav Chizda, from the following brisa. The brisa says, regarding that of a carbon oil of a yerid, Mitama Mikdash, regarding somebody who goes into the Beis HaMikdash as he's tamei, which that obligates him in the carbon oil of as we mentioned, that goes on a 3-scale of financial status of either if he's wealthy, if he's poor, or very poor, which the primary is mentioned by Shavuos Bitui, if someone takes a false oath, or by Shavuos Kail Allah, if he knows testimony and he swears falsely. So the pasuk also says over there, Oy nefesh kisiga. It continues, when it talks about carbon oil of it mentions if someone's going to touch something tamei, which the Gemara Shavuos of Zayman says, it's talking about someone that's became tamei and he either partakes of kachim or goes into the Beis HaMikdash. Where that's where he has the halacha also of the carbon oil of yared, which Taisa says, why don't you just discuss a case of Shmias Kail Allah, which is said earlier in the pasuk. He says we're talking about something that's more common, which that I guess if someone it becomes tamei is a very common thing, and he's metami mikdash. Says the brisa, and he comes into the Beis HaMikdash in a state of tumah. So he wasn't ani, he was a poor person. Now, v'hifresh mo'es lekinoi. He went and he separated, designated money for his peer birth again because he was what's called dal. He's a poor person. His carbon is 2 pairs of birds. He wasn't wealthy enough to bring a chatas behema. Now, but then the hesher, he became wealthy, and now he has to go ahead and bring a chatas behema because he became wealthy. He could afford a more expensive carbon. Then afterwards, what he did was he separated his monies and he designated. And Amar, he says, okay, you know what? Elu chatasai. This monies are for the chatas, ve'eloi lasai, and these are for the oila. Now, as Rashi points out, although right now he does not have an obligation of a carbon ani, rather because he became wealthy, he has to bring a carbon usher, and by carbon usher there is no oila. There's only a chatas behema. So when he's going to come to court, the court's going to tell him that he's got to bring a carbon usher, and he'll bring it. But says the Brisa, so what does he actually do? He separated half, let's say, for the chatas, half of the oil. They're not bringing an oil, they're only bringing a chatas, and it's not even chatas oif, it's chatas behem. So what he does in Meisif, he increases monies from his own wallet, from his own home, until the value of how much the animal is. Well, maybe chayvasa, and he brings his obligatory animal carbon, midmei chatas, it has to be added on only from the monies that he had put aside to be for the chatas. But ve'ein Meisif and maybe chayvasa, but he's not going to increase and add for the chatas behema, midmei lasei, from the monies that he had put away to be the oila, because he cannot change those designations of the monies that he had separated, which he called it an oila. You can't use it and add on to bring a chatas from that. That's what the Brisa says. So he can use the chatas funds, but he can't use the oila funds, because again, he's not bringing the oila anymore. He's not bringing two bird and carbon, he's bringing an animal carbon. Says the Gemara, now over here, after he had separated the funds, is when he had separated the lab shas lekicha. That's not a time of when he purchased it. It's not when he took the funds. When he had separated the funds, he didn't say which is for which. He just put away aside the funds. And the lab shas asihi, and it's not at the time of when he's bringing the carbon. For katani the kava, you said, oh, it's already designated as an oila. He's not allowed to change it. He can't take those funds and add it together and make it that he can bring his chatzis behema. How's that working? It's not when you set aside the funds, which we were calling shas lekicha, and it's not at the time that you actually brought the carbon, of which would be shas asiyah. It's sometime in the middle, a few weeks into when you had set aside the fund. This for the chatzis fund, this for the oila fund, and then later you became wealthy. You have to bring a usher, you have to bring a chatzis behema. He said, no, you can't use those funds. It was already set aside for oila. Let's say set aside. This is for a pair of birds. I thought you told me to be designated as one as a chatas, one oila could either be only at the time of when it was purchased / set aside, or when it was brought. And this was sometime in the middle. You see, it's not like Rav Chizda's halacha. So Rav Sheshes, he says, no, Tizbera, do you really think that it's logical that this Brisa is even correct to ask on Rav Chizda from it? I'll show you that you have to amend the Brisa anyway. Because V'amr B'lazar Rav Heshe, he says in the text of the Brisa, that what's if, let's say, the other way around? Let's say Tama make this usher. Let's say this guy who became Tama and went to the Beis Mikdash, he was a wealthy person. And Vahidi Karbonani, and he doesn't bring, he's a karga, so he's not bringing a chatzas behind him, besides this other poor person brings two birds. He brings a karbonani. He's going to bring two bird karbonas instead of a chatzas behind. So that says, Rabbi and Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi lo yatz, not for this application. As we'll explain on the base, what's the reason for that? But one thing says the Gemara, the kivin de lo yatz, since you see from this version of Rabbi that a korban ani is not fit for an usher, even b'diavad, even after the fact, and the same thing would be if he was a poor person who subsequently became a wealthy person. That even after the fact, it's not going to work for him. So then, heichakava, how are you telling me that? Because if you read the case carefully, you'll see the case was the one that we brought before when we brought the Tashama. We were talking about someone who was an ani when he was in Matam the Mikdash. He separated the monies. He became wealthy, and after he became wealthy, he said, I don't understand. How you tell me that it's even being established as an oila once he became wealthy, he's not a mechayiv in the oila. And even with the it doesn't even work. So how would it even be mistaber to say, to ask on this, onto Rav Chizda from this halacha, that you see, it's been designated for what? You can't designate something not mechayiv. It's not even something that even work even with the a usher that brings the carbon of an ani doesn't work, lo yatsa. So forget about asking Rav Chizda. The Brisa obviously has to be amended anyway because it doesn't make sense. You can't read it. You can't tell me a person, this Matam Mikdash, was separated those oil funds and you can't use it anymore, which we're asking Rav Chizda. You see, it wasn't during the time of L'kich Asiyah. What do you mean? It doesn't make sense anyway. How could you tell me he's kaveya an oil that he can't use it? He's not mechayiv an oil. He's an usher. Rather, what do you have to say? Obviously, you have to say that this price has an error. And you have to say, although it says va'achakach, and only after did he say el chatos or elasa, you have to say it's a mistake. Because it can't be afterwards, like we said, because at that point, in the way, the chronology of the brisa, was already a wealthy person. Rather, you have to say that he had said, Elu l'chatos eloila, and then he became wealthy. You have to say, you have to say that at the time that he established, he was poor at that point. He wasn't wealthy yet, and the carbon was fit for him. So since you have to say anyway that the brisa is mistaken, and that it was something that already was, so you could give the same answer. That you could say and amend and say the Batama Mikdash Ani. There was mafresh the monies for his kinoi, and he said at the time of when he had designated the monies, he said at that point, and only later did he become wealthy. Then he could increase onto the chatas funds and bring his chatas behema. And as Rashi explains, because the hafrasha of the mais is considered like the shas lekich of the oifas. It's the same thing. When you're buying the birds or when you're setting aside the monies, is considered the shas lekicha, and therefore it's not difficult on Rav Chizda, because obviously you have to amend and say that this was already before he became wealthy. I could also say that it was already before, it was at the moment when he was mafreshed, so therefore it's considered shas lekicha. But then the Gemara asks and says that, but Rabbi Yeshia, the Amar that he says that if someone's metame a mikdash as a wealthy person and he brings a karbanani, he disagrees with what we just said from Lazanim and Rabbi Shloimy. He says that actually yatsa, you actually do fulfill your obligation. Oh, so wait a second. So we lose the thrust of our proof to answer for Rav Chizda. So obviously the brisa is not mistaken. The brisa does make sense, and that is because since the korban is fit for even the usher b'diavad, so you could say that if he set aside even after he became wealthy, and he set aside this money to be vanilla, this to be a chatos, it could be kaveya as an oil, because b'diavad, if he would bring it as an oil, it would be oitza. So you can't tell me zegrais, you can't tell me that the brisa is mistaken, and that's how you can answer Rav Chizda. The brisa would make sense that it could be kaveya even after he's wealthy. So as you continue to beis, so Michael Nema. So what are you going to say? As Taisa points out, that everyone agrees to this halacha of Rav Chizda. So according to the version of Rabbi Shloimy, over here, the poor person who became wealthy, you're telling me that it's not a mistake. It could be kaveya b'diavad, because a wealthy person could bring it on these carbon, and it's not shas lekich, and it's not shas asiyah, and it's been kaveya. But how does that work? I thought Rav Chizda said it has to be either lekich or asiyah, and the whole first answer is only based on that I have to prove that the price is mistaken anyway. It has to be that there already was something beforehand. So once I'm saying that, I'll say this. According to Rabbi Shloimy, you don't have to say that because it's not true. It could be even after he was wealthy in the chronology of the brisa, which was that he was first mafresh the monies, became wealthy, and then he said El Chatas Velasei. According to Rabbi Shloimy, that makes sense. He's a wealthy person. But if he brought a carbon on, he would be yaitza, so it could be kaveh. Problem is, but it's not shas lekicha and not shas asiyah. So that says the Gemara that loy tema, don't say the achakach amar, don't say that subsequently he said that elu chatas ve'elalasi. Rather say v'achach lakach v'amar. Say that afterwards he took the monies and he purchased the birds, and he said this is for a chatas and this is for a naila, which as Rashi says that's common, that a Tana will just miss out a word, he'll forget a word and he'll mix it up. Instead of saying v'achach lakach, he'll say v'achach amar. What he means to say is that he purchased. So it's shas lekicha. It's not just the separation of the funds would be one type of lekicha, but actually buying the birds is a lekicha. So therefore you could say it's shas lekicha. Problem is, says the Gemara, how could you even say that? Lakach, if you tell me that he went and he bought and he said this is for the chatas v'oila, so moisim and maybe chatasai. So how do you read the words that you say he's going to add and he's increase for his obligatory, now that he's wealthy, to bring a behema from the monies of the chatas? But my new, what is that? It's not monies anymore. You tell me he already bought 2 birds. So how could you add on to the bird to bring chatas behema? Oh, so what are you going to say? The paraklay. No, we're talking about where the bird that you bought, which could be kaveh because it's shas lekicha, you go and you deconsecrate it, and you make it, you redeem it, and it now becomes chulin. And then you add on monies from your coffers from your house, and together with those monies you got back from the bird chatas, you buy with the monies you have from your house, you buy chatas behema. Says Yoma, you can't say that because by aim pidyon life, there is no redemption for a bird carbon, as the Mishnah teaches Masechet another Daf Yomi made. Oifais, birds, levine, the frankincense, the klishar, service vessels don't have a pidyon because it only says in the Torah regarding a behema. So what are you going to say? How could you say that Meisav and Mevi, because you might, as Shas Lekicha means to say, when you actually bought the birds, how you being Meisav and Mevi Chatasa, you're Chatz Behema from a bird, which you can't add on money onto a bird, and you can't redeem a bird. So Amar Papi says, no, it's not difficult. It's talking about it's Shas Lekicha, but you have to understand the case like this. We're talking about where the guy bought one bird from his money that he had a pile of money. And this is what the Tana is saying. If he went, it's Shas Lekicha, he bought a bird but only one. If he bought an Ayla, that means that by default, the monies that are left over are Chattas monies. Because obviously this was Ayla and now this is Chattas. Oh, then maybe Chayvasim and Meichatasim. Then we're saying, okay, go bring your obligatory Chattas Behema now from those Chattas monies. And that Ayla which you bought, obviously you're not using anymore because you bring a Chattas Behema, which you don't bring an Ayla with that. It'll go for Nadav, which place discuss exactly what type of Nadav it's going to go to. But Ichatas Oven, if you purchase a Chattas, so then that must be that the pile of money that you have left over on the table is an Ayla. Because when you purchase the Chattas, that's an Ayla. Then we're saying, you can't add on to those monies from the Ayla monies to bring your Chattas Behema. You're going to have to bring from those monies the Aylas Nadava. Because you cannot add on and change an Ayla into Chattas. And the Chattas Ha'ayf that you bought, also you're not using, because you bring Chattas Behema, that will go and be left to die. And from his house, you're going to have to bring all the new monies to bring a Chattas Behema. Therefore, it's not difficult on Rav Chizda. It's Taka Shas Lekicha. You had your monies. You were Ani that was Metamid in English. You set aside monies to bring the pair of birds. And then, you became wealthy. And then, according to Rabbi Shloimy, even though you're wealthy, but you have it, if you bring the two birds, you bring a Chattas and Ayla, because an Asher that brings a Korban Ani is Yaitza. And then, but you bought one bird. And that's what the Bryce is saying, that depends which bird you bought, that will reflect regarding the leftover monies. So if you bought an Ayla, leftover money is a Chattas. That's we're saying you could add on, and that's Shas Lekicha. It can be Kaveya, because that's when you bought the birds. It's not V'amar, it's V'lakach V'amar. You bought one bird, and then the others are monies, and that will depend if the leftover monies are Ayla, then you can't do anything with it. If the leftover monies are Chattas, then you could add on to those monies and bring a Chattas name, and there is not difficult on Rav Chizda. Now once we brought in this machlekes regarding if a Metame Mikdash Asher brings on these carbon, if it's Yoitz or not, so the Gemara discussing that now. Gufo. Amr Rabbi Lasser. He says, Amr Rabbi Shia, Metame Mikdash Asher. Someone was Tameh and he went to the base of Mikdash, and he's giving a Gevir, a wealthy person. The heavy carbon on, and he brings a poor person's carbon. Instead of bringing his Chattas B'ayim, he brings two birds. Lo Yotz is not fulfilling his obligation. From Chagam Rabbi Shia says, no Yotz, he has to fulfill his obligation. So the Gemara says, Meisvei. The Gemara asks on Reb Chaga, the one we just said, that says, you are Yetzirah, Mishnah Masechtas Negoyim. Mishnah says, Mitzayru Ani. Mitzayru Ani is also one of those that brings a carbon of the year, depending on how much money he has. So a poor Mitzayru, Shehibi carbon Asher, brings a wealthy person's carbon. Yeah, he pushes himself, he doesn't have, he makes collections. Yotza, he fulfills obligation. Asher, Shehibi carbon Ani, but let's say a Gevir, a Mitzayru, that brings a carbon Ani, Lo Yotza, is not fulfilling his obligation. So you see clearly, not like Reb Chaga, you see that if you are an Asher and you bring on these carbon, you're not fulfilling your obligation. So how could he say Metame Mikdash Asher brings the carbon on his Yaitza? Says Yimano Shani Hasama, Mitzayr is different. You're right, Mitzayr is one of the four that bring carbon out of the yard, but he's specifically different. Why? Specifically because the pasuk says in Mayikra, it says Zois. It says Zois Tiyateres Mitzayr, which tells us only over here will have the halacha that if you're an Asher and you bring a carbon ani, that you're not going to be Yaitza. But elsewhere, like Metame Mikdash V'Kadasha, that even if you're Asher bringing ani on this carbon, you'll be Yaitza. Says, wait a second. If that's the case, then Reisha Nami. Then the Reisha should also be, if you're an Ani that brings a carbon Asher, you also shouldn't be Yaitz because it says Zeis. Zeis Tiyah says this is how it has to be. It can't be any other carbon. You tell me if you're an Asher, you have to bring an Asher, not an Ani, so then Ani also have to bring Ani's carbon, not an Asher carbon. It says, the Tyrus. The Tyrus, it says there in the Parsha, Zeis Tiyah Tyrus and Mitzayr, Tyrus tells us that there's going to be one law for all the Mitzayr, meaning the older Yaitz with one carbon, meaning the carbon of the Asher. And says the Gemara about Tanya, and this is what we learned in the Brisa. On the one hand, it says Tyrus. which is l'rabis mitzayra ani, to include if a poor mitzayra shebi carbon usher brings a big carbon of the usher, then it's going to be yaitza, because Torah says we will have one law. Now, yachla for the usher shebi carbon ani, then you would think, okay, the same thing would be in the reverse. If a usher brings a ani's carbon, that we're all the same. No, it says zayis. This has to be exactly as the Torah is telling you, that if you're an usher, you got to bring the usher's carbon. Okay, says the Gemara, v'neilach minna. So fine. So I understand that you're telling me that mitzvah is different because it says zayis, which tells me that no, it's got to be exactly as you are, which is the usher has to bring an usher's carbon and can bring an ani's carbon. But why don't we learn now Thomas Mikdash Kedusha, which is one of the other carbon of the Yeretz? Why don't we learn that also, that if an usher brings on these carbons, it's not going to be yaitz, just like you see over there. Usually you learn out from the contextual comparison to another carbon of the Yeretz that it's got to be zayis. Says the Gemara, no, Midrachman, the Torah is excluding, and it says Vimdal Hu is a miyut by Mitzayra that says if he's poor, means to say the wealthy person that brings a carbon on is not going to be yaitza. But other chiyuvi carbon of the Yeretz, he's not going to have this halacha of zayis. Because it's saying Vimdal Hu to tell us that this halacha of a wealthy person being different than the poor person, because it says zayis, it's only Hu. It's only by the Mitzayr. The Torah is excluding, but all other carbon will not have the halacha, and all other them you will be able to be the evet, even if you're an usher that brings a carbon ani. That's how Reb Chagia, Reb Chagia learns in this halacha of Mitzayr usher being a carbon ani. It's only over there and not by Mitam Mikdash Kedash. Now we continue with the halacha in the next Mishnah, continuing on this theme of Avodas in Kippurim. So we already spoken about that the Kohen Gadol had done the vidu once before on his power, and he did the lottery, as we said in the previous Mishnah, regarding the two seirim. Now we continue on Kashaloshin Shal Sahiris. He ties on a thread of red wool, B'reish Shlar Mishtalech, on the head of the higot that's sent away. Ve'mid Keneged Beis Shuluchay. And they face the Sar Mishtalech opposite the gate, which is Shar Nikanor, which they're going to take him out from. They face in that direction. Now, V'lanishchat, and regarding the other animal, that Lashem, that's going to be slaughtered, they put it Keneged Beis Shchitase. They put it, the Gemara is going to explain exactly what that's going on, but it's going to be going on this red string, that they put that string by that higot opposite the area where it's slaughtered. Now, Bola Yitzl Parishnis. Now he's coming back to his bull for a second time. And he leans his two hands on the animal, and he confesses. And this is what he said: Ana Hashem, please Hashem, Avisi, Shati, Chatasi Levanecha, the three different types of sins, deliberate and wanton and by mistake. Ani Uvesi, me and my family. And this is the reason why he's saying it a second time, because here in this one he's adding on, Uvnei Aaron Kedushecha, and the sons of Aaron, your holy people. Ana Hashem, please Hashem, Kaperna, for atone, please, La'avonis, La'pshol, La'chatoim, the wanton, deliberate, and the unintentional sins. Shabisi, B'shpashat, B'shachatos, Levanetham. Ani Uvesi, me and my family, B'nei Aaron Kedushecha, and the sons of Aaron, your holy people. Like it says in the Torah of Moshe, your servant, because on this day, they will atone on you, to purify you, from all your sins. Lefnei Hashem, the Torah in front of Hashem, you'll be purified. And here in this video, he said Hashem. So the people responded after him, Baruch Shem, blessed is the name, the glory of his kingdom, forever and ever. Now, the following question: when it says v'lenishchat, when it says that for the animal that was slaughtered, that it says that they put it neged be'shchitasai, opposite the place where it's going to be slaughtered, there's two things that we could compare to what we said regarding the Sar Mishtalech. Sar Mishtalech, we spoke about where you put the red string, and we also said which direction you face it to get it ready to send it away. And then we said, but the lenishchat, we said that's going to be keneged be'shchitasai. So we're not sure which variable are we comparing the nishchat to that of the Sar Lazaz. Is it going akshirakai? Is it going on the tying of the string? That we're saying that, by the Sar Lazaz we tied on the horns, here we're going to do it keneged be'shchitasei, which means to say we're going to tie the string by its neck, where it's slaughtered. Or are we saying that the Sar Lashem, we're going to direct it towards the place where it's being slaughtered? That's what we meant keneged makom shchitasei, because by the Sar Lazaz we mentioned two variables. We said what we're doing with the string, and we also mentioned which direction you're facing it. And we We said, well, l'nishchat, oh, that's keneged b'shchitase. What's keneged b'shchitase? The direction that you face it towards where it's slaughtered, or we're going on the string, that you're going to tie the string on that animal where it's slaughtered. So it says, what Tashmat's being right, because the turn of Yisrael taught a Brisa, Kasha Lashon Shal Zahiris, that they tied the string of the red thread, on the head of the higo that was sent away, and the midi connected, like we said in the Mishnah, they faced it to the direction of where they're going to send it out from, which was Ab through Shar Nikna. Now, for the Nishchat, and for the one that was slaughtered, in these words we said in the Mishnah, connected b'shchitase, the opposite word slaughtered, and says the Brisa why? Shleis Arav Zebezeh, that the Sar La Zazel should not get mixed up with the Sar La Hashem, and that they shouldn't get mixed up with all the other karbanos that are there in the Azar. Now, says the Gemara this. If you think to say that what we say, what's connected b'shchitase, is the tying of the red string, that it's around the neck, which is makam shchitase, so Shabbat, that makes sense. Now they're not going to get mixed up one with the other, because the Sar La Zazel is tied on its head, and the Sar La Hashem, the string is tied on its neck. Neither are they going to get mixed up with other karbanos, because these two have red strings tied on them, and the other ones don't have red strings tied on them. So that would make sense. But if you say, when we say v'lenishchat, that it's a hamadakoi, or telling you that keneged b'shchitase means which direction are you facing it, and this of the tying of the red string is only on the sar mishtaleach, which then it's not going to get mixed up obviously with the Sar Lashem, because the Sar Lashem has no red string and the Sar Zazel has a red string, and neither is the Sar Zazel going to get mixed up with other karbanos because it only has a string and no other carbon. But you're right. You're right, the Sar Mishtalech is not going to get mixed up with the other one, with the Sar Lashem, with the Sar Panimi, because the High Katrabe, because the Sar Zazel has a string tied onto it. The High Katrabe, and the Sar Lashem does not have a red string tied onto it. But Bachrinim is Ma'arvi, but the Sar Lashem is going to get mixed up with other karbanos because it doesn't have a red string, and all the other karbanos doesn't have a red string. So how are you going to tell me that that's going to prevent the Sar Lashem from getting mixed up? You tell me it's just faced in a certain direction, but it doesn't have any string on it. So it still might get mixed up, the Sar Lashem, with other karbanos. Allah Shmamina, rather obviously, that Akshirakai, when we're saying that the Makam Shchitasai is going on where you tie a string on the Sar Lashem. Shmamina, obviously that's what it means. Keneged b'shchitas is not the direction that you face it. It's going on the string that, although the Sar Lazaz you put it on the head, on the Sar Lashem you put it around its neck, which is makam shchitas. Now the Gemara continues regarding this lashon shal zahiris, regarding this red thread. So Rabbi Yitzchak, he says shtei l'shayin l'shanat. He says, I heard a halacha regarding two strings of red thread, and I heard a difference between them. One's going on the paraduma, the red heifer, which the pasuk in the midbar yates that the kohen take 8 eras, the cedar wood, the ezem, and the hyssop, the shnita loss, and the red thread. And one's regarding the red thread of the higo that's sent away, which we just spoke about, has a red thread on its head. He says, I heard that achas tzricha shiur. One of them requires a minimum measurement, which he must explain shortly what is that shiur. Achas in the tzricha shiur, and I heard regarding one of them that it doesn't have a shiur, meaning no matter how small it is, it's going to be valid. I don't know which is which. I don't know, is it the paraduma that it doesn't have a shiur, or so much the left does not have a shiur? So Rabbi Yisrael says, Nefzenan. He says, let's look, let's analyze. So much the left, the boy chalukah. But the Samar Shalech, Mishnah teaches later on the Samar Zayin and Aleph, that what they would do is, the one that was sending the he-goat off the cliff, he would actually cut the string in half. He would tie half onto a rock, and half he would tie between the horns of the Samar Shalech. Oh, so then by a shiur. Obviously, it has to have a minimum measurement. It has to be big enough to cut in half. But by the paraduma, where you don't have to separate, all you do is throw into the fire. So then, by shiur, it's the one that doesn't have to have a measurement. Now, however, Maskil Rami Bachama. Ram Bachama asked, he says, no, the paranami bay kaivid. It's not true. The paraduma, the red string has to have some weight to it. And therefore, it obviously has to have a measurement, because it has to have a certain amount of weight, because it has to fall into the depth of the fire, which you burn the para together with all these other things in the fire, and you use the ashes for the paraduma waters. It says, you have to throw it inside the fire. So it has to have some weight. So no, to the contrary, the paraduma is the one that has to have a shiur. Because if it's too lightweight, it's like a feather. It's not going to, by the chumetz brand, and you try to throw in the chumetz and the feathers like flying there, didn't make it in, right? Yeah, it has to have some weight. It has to have a shiur. So that's the one that has to have the shiur. So Rava says no, not necessarily. Could be the Samash Shalech is the one that has to have a shiur because you have to cut in half. Because Kovet Tanoi, this halacha that you tell me that has to have some weight is actually Machlekes Tanoim that the Gemara is going to bring later on in the sugya. And if it's possible, according to the one that holds that it doesn't have to have kovet, that's the one that doesn't have to have a shiur. But the Gemara continues to ask and says, what, with the parla by chalukah, you tell me that the Samash Shalech is the one that its thread has to have a shiur because it has to be cut in half. And the paraduma, its thread, it does not get split in half too. But Abaya asks from a Mishnah Masechtas Para, which says Ketzir Oisa, the one who's burning the paraduma and all the other elements, the eitz eres and the shnei talas, what does he do? So Karchan, he wraps the cedar wood and the hyssop b'shiyari lashon, with the leftovers of the red thread. Now, by saying shiyari, it sounds like that obviously there's other parts of the red thread that you did something with. So obviously you're splitting it in half, so that also has to have a shiur then. So Amos says, no, it means biznav lashon. It means with the tail of the thread. Meaning, it was the red thread was combed with a comb. So when you comb something, generally it becomes narrow on the end, like shiare, like the leftovers, and that's like a tail. And that's why you say you wrap it with the tail of the thread, but there's no splitting up the paraduma thread in half. When we say shiare lashon, we don't mean that because there's a leftovers from something else. It just means because you had combed it out and it gets oskish stuff like that, and that's what I mean. But therefore, again, it could still be like Rabbi Yosef had proposed that it's the Samash Shalech, so there has to be have a shiur. But the paraduma, A, we're not going like Mandama that holds a kovet, and also B, there is no shiare lashon. There's no cutting in half, and if it does not require a shiur. Now, related to this, Amar B'chana Amar Rav, he says, eitz eres, the cedar wood, the shnei talas, and the red thread, which again you have to throw it into the fire so it gets burnt with the paraduma. If shekal tasan shal heves, if it doesn't fall into the actual fire that the par is burning in, it just gets singed in the ear. It's like the flames flicker and catch and flame up and burn it in the ear. Shera, that's going to be valid for burning the eitz eres and the shnei talas. Which makes the Gemara asks from the following brisa. Brisa says this haviv halashon of, let's say the red thread gets singed, then you didn't fulfill. Maybe lashon acham mekadosh. You have to bring another red string, and you have to put it in there. And this way we say mekadosh, as Rashi, is whatever we do with the paradim, we call it kiddush. But you see, you're not yetza. So how are you saying that you are yetza? So my Brisa says, lakash, it's not difficulty. It depends what. Kan, the Brisa that says that you're not going to be yetza, is bekelachas. We're talking about a fire that has a pillar of fire that's shooting up like a kelach, like a root like a string of a tall grass, which then you have to bring another red string. Kan, Reb Chanan that said that it's going to be valid is benechfefes. We're talking about by a low down flame, which is bent over, which is very close to the coal, even though so to speak gets burned from the fire. That's really called al toich. If it's a huge flame flickering up, we're not calling that al toich srevis apara. So that's where you're not going to be yetz if it got singed in the ear. But if it was a very low fire and it got burned, it just didn't, let's say, touch the coal, that's called a toich srevis apara, and therefore you're going to be yetz. That's one approach. Rambam says another approach, and that's why he brought this in. Kovid, the weight is tanoihi, is the machlekes tanoim, and that machlekes is the machlekes between Reb Chanan and the Brisa. The time I learned the Brisa, Lama Karchan. Why does he wrap the eitz eres with the shnei talas? So one pshat is kadesh yikul magudachas. The Rebbe holds so that they should all be together, and we want them to be at the same time. So that's the same thing as Rav, that he says no, we didn't wrap it as like the other Tana is going to say, so that it should have weight, that it should fall inside. It doesn't have to have weight. It doesn't have to fall inside. Oh, so that's what Rav said, that even if it gets singed in the ear, you're going to be yetzer. But Rabbi Shloimy, he says, no, the reason why you tie the eitz eres and the hyssop with the shnei talas is because you should kovet. When you have it all together, you wrap it all together and you throw it in, it has weight. Then the yiplu to serve as a par, then it's going to fall into the fire of the paraduma. That's like the Brisa, who held that not yetzer if it didn't fall into the fire. So this is not difficult in Rav Chanan. This that the Brisa disagrees with him is a machlekes tanoim of if you need to have kovet or not. Now, continuing on the theme of the different types of red strings, it says shalosh l'shem shemati. Before, the previous halacha was regarding two strings, regarding if it needs a shiur or not. He says, I heard regarding three red strings. One's of the paraduma, which we said you burn in the fire with the paraduma. One's of the higo that gets sent off the cliff, which you tied on half on the rock and half on its horns. One is also by a mitzayra, which it also says he also has to have a red string, which Taisa points out, says, wait a second, why didn't they talk about a fourth red string, that of the Sar Panimi, which we said in the Mishnah? We said that the Sar Panimi, the Sar Hashem, also had a red string. So it says Taisa no, because that string was only just so it's just not to get mixed up, not to get confused with the Sar Lazal, so they obviously didn't have a share at all. Regarding all these other ones, since there's a utility for them, so you could say that there's a certain shir that has to have, and the Sar Shtalech also we needed, it wasn't just as a sign, because you needed to know if it's going to turn white, like it says Kashila Galbinu, so there was a utility, but here we're not going to mention the Sar Lashem, that red string, because that didn't have any utility, that was just not to get mixed up. Now, so regarding these three red strings, Achas Mishkal Asar Zuz, one of them has to have a weight of 10 zuz, which is 2.5 slum. The Achas Mishkal Shnei Slum, one a little bit less, has to have a weight of 2 slum, which is that of 8 zuz. The Achas Mishkal Shekel, one having the weight of a shekel, which is 2 zuz. The Ein Lefarishim says, I don't know how to explain which one is the bigger one, which is smaller, the smallest, and which one is the medium size. For these three Shnei Telas, and there's 3 red strings, there's the Paraduma, Samash Talech, and Mitzayra. I know one has the most, one has the middle, and one has the least. I don't know which is which. Now, however, says the Gemara, Kiyas Rabban. Rabban came, he says, Pirsh Mishmid Rabbi Yonis, and he explained the name of Rabbi Yonis and which is which. We've seen them in Bezim and Al. Shel Para, that of the Paraduma, is Mishkal Asar Zuz. That's the one that has the most weight, has to have a weight of 10 zuz, because it's going like the Manda Amar, that requires Kavod, which Taisa explains. He seems to be not the Manda Amar, but that's what Rashi says, that you have to have that weight, so it has to be heavy, it has to have a heavy string, it's got to make it inside the fire, and therefore it has to have a weight of 10 zuz. Now, that weight, the red string of the higo that's sent away, is Mishkal Shnei Slum. It's a little bit less, it's 8 zuz, because it has to be cut in half, so it's got to have a weight of 2 slum, which means to say that it's going to be bigger, because obviously you go by weight, you're going to get more quantity, so that's sufficient to cut in half. Now, B'shel Mitzayra, which neither requires weight and neither does require to be split in half, so there it's sufficient with a Mishkal Shekel, with a weight of a shekel, which is just 2 zuz. Now, additionally, a machlekes regarding this topic, Rabbi Yechanan, he says, Pligi bar Rabbi Shimon chalaftu Rabbanan b'para. There's a machlekes regarding that of the paraduma. Chada amar mishkal asar. One says, like we said before, that the weight of the paraduma's red string was 10 zuz. But Chada amar mishkal shekel. The other one says, no, actually by paraduma, which we said, especially according to Mandama, that does not require kavod, and you don't have to cut in half. It says, no, it's enough with just a shekel. And a samanech and a manik, so that you don't make a mistake and think that one of them actually said that the weight is 2 slime, which was the medium measurement. We had 10 zuz, 2 slime, and 1 shekel, which we said that that's the 3 measurements. Not to make a mistake, what these 2 opinions said. So as a mnemonic to recall, you can recall a famous Mishnah Masechet Menachet of Kuf Yud Amud Aleph is Echad Amar ve'Echad Amamid. Whether you do a lot or if you do a little, as long as you have intent for the name of heaven, it's going to be okay. Now with this simon, you can remember that one of them had given the largest measurement of them all, which was of 10 zuz. The other one gave the smallest measurement of them all, which was 1 shekel. But the middle measurement was not mentioned here in this machlekes regarding what's the shiur of the paraduma. Now Amalai Rav Yimmer Diftel Ravin, he actually disagrees, says no. Loiba par pligi. Their machlekes was not in the red string of the paraduma. The machlekes was regarding the red string of the higot. And a proof for this is, because Yoma, that day that they were disagreeing, Noch nafshe de Rabbi Bar Kisi. Rabbi Bar Kisi passed away. The Antchu Beisimana, and they made a mnemonic to recall what they were disagreeing about. And they said that Rabbi Bar Kisi was a Talmud Chacham. He was mechaper kisar mishtalech. He atones like the higot that's sent away. Because as we know, as the Gemara says in Moed Katan of Chavchazim and Alf, Misas Tzadikim is mechaperes, the death of a righteous atones like a carbon. Because it says, why is the death of Aaron mentioned near the Big Tikkun? To tell you just like Big Tikkun, mechaper tzot to Misas Tzadikim and mechaper. So when he died, they said, oh, he was mechaper like the Samash Tlech, which was coming to remind them that the machlekes that was had on that day, that how much of the weight of the red string, is it 10 zuz or is it 1 shekel, was in the topic of a Samash Taleach, and that's what they were disagreeing about which again we had said in the first version that there was actually a Beinani, but one says no, you have to have the most, one says you have to have the least, and that it was in that and not in that of the paraduma. Some of these we discussed in today's daf, the Yoma Daf Mem Aleph. We had a teaching from Rabbi Shloimy that said that the pure birds are designated either b'lekichas bailam, when you actually purchase it, or basiyas when the kohen actually brings it. Why? Because there's two psukim, one by Yeledes and one by Zava, which says v'lakcha and ba'asa. V'lakcha is when you buy it, and ba'asa is when you bring it. And it says echad chatzis v'achad oila. Those are the two psukim that say one's gonna be chatzis, one oila. To tell you, carry one of those two. Now, but the Gemara has a list of questions regarding this halacha. We had a brace in the previous stop that said we had a havamina to say there would be effective kedusha shem but Yom Kippurim. Well, that would be at the time of the Hagrala, which is not time of the Kicha, not Shas Asiyah. Says the Gemara, no, that would be the Kavachayim would tell you b'Shas L'Kicha, b'Shas Asiyah. It should work kedusha Hashem to make the Sa'ar Lashem into a Chatas, and they were saying no, because Baso Chatas tells you the Hagrala is Ma'akiv that it won't work even b'Shas L'Kicha, b'Shas Asiyah. So it's not difficult enough. The havamina would have been that it would have been a Shas Akicha and Shas Asiyah. Another question the Gemara had was Metam Mikdash Ani. And we said if he was Mafresh Mois Likina and became wealthy, and then he says Elachatase ve'Elalase, and you see that what? You cannot bring the money from the Oila to add on and to bring a Chatas. What do you mean? The monies that you designated was not at the time that you separated. It's not time of Asiyah. I thought you told me that, like Rav Chizah says, you could only be b'shas Akicha b'shas Asiyah by the peers of the bird. So what do you tell me you can't add on? It's not going to be designated. So the Gemara has two answers. Either, anyways, the Brisa is mistaken, because you have to say that it already was said. Oh, how do I know that? Because how could you say that he was already wealthy and he was designating an oila? It doesn't work even with the Evid anyway. So how can he make an oila to say that, oh, he can't add on to that? It's going like a Baisha that says that Metam Mikdash Asher brings on these carbon, it's not Yaitza. So obviously you have to tell me that he already did it before. It wasn't chronologically correct, this Brisa. It was already before he became wealthy. Okay, then you could also say that, to answer Rav Chizda, that he already said Mishas Afrasha, because anyways it's Mishtabish, anyways it's the error. And when he separated, that's when he said El Chatas Ve'Elosi, which is Shas L'Kicha. Or you could say, even according to Reb Oishia, it actually holds that no, if an usher brings the on these carbon, he's going to be yaitza, so that's not a proof that the Bryce is mistaken. But you have to say that you're right. It wasn't subsequently that he just said Eilechatos ve'elasi. He was lokach ba'amar, and that's considered shas l'kicha. With those monies, he bought the bird karbanis, and that's shas l'kicha. Now the problem is, but if he was lokach ba'amar, then what are you being moisiv and maybe chayvasai? How do you add on to a bird? You can't redeem a bird. So how are you adding on to bring your chatas be'ema? So the Gemara says, yes, an interesting answer. He bought one bird, and depending which bird he bought, will tell us what the remaining monies are. So if you bought an oila bird, that means the remaining monies are chatas. It could be moisiv al chatasai, or maybe chayvasai of a chatas be'ema. But if you bought a chatas, if the remaining monies are oila, you can't add on to that. So it's not the Gemara Rav Chizda. It was b'shas l'kicha. And yes, we're talking about the monies that are remaining, which one that is, if you could add on, depending if it's an oilo or if a chatas. Now, in that discussion came up a machlekes regarding if a Matam Mikdash Usher brings a carbon of an ani, if he's going to fulfill his obligation or not. But Mitzvah, you see, clearly says, who's also oil b'yared, which depending on your financial status of your Usher ani, that you're not going to be yaitza. And how do you know that? Because it says Zeis. Although Mitzvah ani that brings carbon Usher, you are yaitza because it says Tairas. But here it says Zeis, which tells you, no, you gotta be, if you're wealthy, you gotta bring a wealthy person's carbon. So why don't you say the same thing also regarding other carbonas? No, because the Torah says Vindal who? If he's poor, which tells us only by him it's gonna have this halach of Mitzvah Asher not being to Mitzvah Ani. But Rabbi Aisha would hold by all the other carbon that will be like Metam Mikdash Kedashav, that even if you're wealthy, you bring your carbon Ani, but the Evid, you're going to be Yetz. We went on to the next Mishnah. We said that okay, now they tie on, they're coming back to they already did the lottery now with the two seirim. So they tie the red string on the head of the Samar Shalech, and he placed it towards where they're going to send it away from, which that's going to be much later in the day. And the Nishchat, which is the Sar Hashem, they put it Kenega Beshchetas, which ultimately explains what's Kenega Beshchetas, not the direction that you're facing it towards the earring and the Azor where you're going to slaughter it. It means where you're going to put the red string on the Sar Hashem. Then you're going to put where you sheft it on its neck, And then he comes back to his power a second time because they interrupted that he did a vida on his power once before. Then he went to do the hagrola on the seir. Now he's coming back to his power a second time. And he does vida because here he has on the words Uvenei Aaron Am Kedushecha. Now he mentions not only his family, but he mentions all Kahanim about the second vida. And the Gemara mentioned there's three types of strings. You have that of the paraduma, which is a machlekes, but it requires weight, and therefore, according to one interpretation, it requires 10 zuz, which is the heaviest. Then you have sar mishtaleach, which it needs to be divided, so it's also got to have weight, not as much, because it doesn't have to have weight, but it's got to have a measurement of 2 slam. And then you have the red string of the mitzayir, which doesn't have to be split, doesn't have to have weight, and therefore it's enough when it's just a weight of a shekel. And there were other opinions also, like we had echad amar b'echad amamit, which was a reminder to say, which actually in that machlekes, there was actually 2 different versions. Is that going on the para, or was that going on the sar mishtaleach? But one was saying the most that has to be, which is 10 zuz, and one was saying the least, which is only 1 shekel. Thank you to any time.